What's up, everyone? We have a gorgeous day in western North Carolina. We're out at Bent Creek. I haven't been out here in about a month or so, and it's been far too long. The more times I find justification to not get out here and rebalance myself is exactly the time I need to get out here and rebalance myself. So I've been very busy with projects in life and busy work and just crap that matters, but not really, you know what I'm talking about? So found time and made myself get out here with some natural exposure, and we're going over just my thoughts about how to balance stress in my life and my shortcomings, and perhaps this will be helpful to someone else. Hopefully you can hear me. There is an amazing babbling brook behind me. Every time I'm out at Bent Creek, I try to find a different stream and follow it, just because aside from ocean waves, a babbling brook is the most medicinal sound to my brain, and we'll go over probably why that is coming up. If you hear people in the background, it's because there's a ton of bikers out. It's a gorgeous day, so everyone's out trying to get some negative ion exposure. So, just to go over a couple of things I've been thinking about. Recently, I've had to get a sound machine because I live next to a road, which has never happened before. And it's been the last year or so that I live right on a main road. And I've never had trouble sleeping before, but I've started developing bags under my eyes for the first time in my entire life, just because I don't think I'm getting as deep a sleep as I'm used to. So I've had to get a sound machine, and the sound that I landed on with the 20 different options was a babbling brook. I didn't have anything growing up. Where I grew up, there was no noise, so I slept like a brick every night. And the sound machine had trains and just loud white noise, and to me, when I was cycling through them, I was like, these aren't calming, but I guess it's what you were used to when you were growing up that your brain associated with sleep. So for some people, that's just train, that's a constant buzz of a highway, whatever you got used to and adapted to your sleep. But for me, that was nothing. So this sound is the sound of tranquility to me, just water in all of its forms. And I've been trying to figure out how to be more in line with my natural surroundings on a more day-to-day basis. I get out and I go for walks and runs, but it feels forced because it's not actually in the woods. There's something about the woods, and it's higher oxygen levels, obviously. I'm lucky enough to live in such a lush, even in the winter, climate with evergreen rhododendron all around me, moss growing. So that natural exposure and reconnection is always available, and I just have to actually make the conscious effort to do it, which I need to be better at. But just going over how anything that's woo-woo, seemingly, such as being in nature, earthing, grounding, surfing, any of those things, science is slowly discovering why they feel so good. It used to be that having your feet in the ground or being on the water was just woo-woo because we didn't know why it was calming. By calming, I mean whenever you're in the natural world, your cortisol levels come down, your sensory perceptions enhance, so your ears perk up, your eyes become finely attuned, you notice the minutia of your natural surroundings, you stop thinking quite as much, so it's actually harder for me to articulate myself out in nature because all the things that I'm ruminating on and thinking through and processing when I'm walking, whenever I get next to a babbling brook, calm down. My brain slows down. If you don't know what the Schumann resonance is, that is the Earth's organism, if you will, natural cycle, and I believe it's about 8 hertz. as in 8 cycles per second. You can think of a pulse, so to speak. So a wah, 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 kind of like that. If you looked at a scale, it just means you would have 8 sine waves, 8 of those per second. And that's the natural cycle. Everything we do in modernity, even in our house, as tranquil as we can make it, takes away from that natural cycle. Your Wi-Fi router, your cell phone, Wi-Fi, or even old cell phone technology was around 8 megahertz, and that is 8 million cycles a second. Your Wi-Fi router at 2.4 gigahertz is 2.4 billion cycles per second. I'm sure most of you knew that, but just to give you an order of magnitude. So whenever you feel antsy, anxious, fidgety, trouble concentrating, trouble focusing, our bodies are pretty resilient, and we're able to cope with all of those things bombarding us all at once. But one of the reasons it's so easy to de-stress, to come back to center, to take deeper breaths when we're back out in the woods is because, especially if you're not right under a cell tower, a lot of those interferences disappear. You're able to move back into that slower pulse of the earth. Water has its own frequency. Moving natural cycles have their own frequency. Surfers are more relaxed just because they're getting a ton of negative ion exposure. I'll do an entirely separate video as I learn more of the research on our electrical bodies. We're basically a battery. Every cell has milliamperage charge, has voltages, which is how the mineral exchanges work in our cells. They work on calcium ion channels, potassium ion channels, sodium ion channels, and each one of those has a charge, which is why earthing and surfing and being outside at elevation, exposed to water vapor, whenever the sun, and obviously that's overly simplistic, but whenever ultraviolet radiation, photons, come through and hit water vapor, they refract and negative ions are floating around. Same thing if you stand on with your naked feet on the ground, you absorb a lot of those negative ions, and that makes you a little more rebalanced. We get a ton of positive ions in our day-to-day lives, but we're mostly shielded in our houses, rubber soles, whatever, shielded from those negative ions. So it's extremely beneficial, and most people feel immediate relief. Immediate, like within seconds, just being outside in the natural world, devoid of A, electromagnetic radiation, and B, just the stresses of everyday life. It even feels different when I have a camera going, because the camera's got a Wi-Fi signal pumping out, is generating an electromagnetic field. So I need to be better at getting out here because I take deeper breaths. Just that. Whenever I get out into nature, I notice that I take belly breaths, and we're supposed to take belly breaths. You'll notice that everything becomes a little easier to decipher. So your thoughts tend to slow down. Take deeper breaths from my diaphragm. I take the shallow breaths that I'm used to taking, especially if I'm over caffeinated, subside, and everything calms down. My metabolism slows down, and in that stillness that you will find, it's easier to sort through persistent thought patterns. It's easier to see what's serving you and what's no longer serving you. For example, caffeine becomes extremely apparent when you're getting into a more slower meditative state and your brain waves start shifting slowly. You'll start noticing that caffeine doesn't serve you in that state. So what serves you in a productive work mode doesn't serve you in a mindful, still state. And that's fairly obvious to most people. But if you're sensitive to things, or I should say, if you don't know what you're sensitive to, just come out of the woods and just breathe through your nose for 5 minutes. You'll notice what pops up in your mind, what keeps popping up in your mind, and the difference between stimulants and a more calming metabolic state as to your breathing levels. And the breath is the barometer. The breath is the thing you can always come back to. It controls your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic being the fight or flight state, parasympathetic being rest and digest. And the science around that, even that, is changing. Wim Hof kind of opened the door to that. We thought that the parasympathetic or the sympathetic, which is your bodily processes, your organs, your heartbeat, weren't controllable. And Wim Hof, the Iceman, if you don't know who he is, showed most people what ancient mystery schools and what traditional cultures had known forever, which is you can control everything. You can control your immune system, you can control your mind, you can control your heartbeat, you can control everything. You can focus on certain parts of your body when you're in that brainwave state. You can focus conscious attention on certain aspects of your body that might be telling you they need attention. For me, it's always my hips, my sacral area, and my shoulders and my traps. That's where I hold stress. I notice that whenever I breathe, this trap is always tight. Trap being trapezius muscle, this guy. And that's because, especially when I'm reviewing footage, that's where I hold my mouse. And I have an ergonomic setup, but even then, I hold my mouse with this hand, and that's a good portion of my day-to-day, and that raises my trap. So my conscious effort whenever I do a meditative or just stillness practice is to work everything out and then make sure I'm balanced. Things like that. I find it beneficial to check in with myself. At least 5 or 10 minutes a day. See what's tight, what needs attention, what I need to work on in the gym specifically, and what I need to be better at rebalancing my lifestyle, or rebalancing my body from my lifestyle. So I just wanted to chat about what had been going on with my body, things I've been noticing. We'll go into detail about electromagnetism and the science, the new science of negative ions and our electromagnetic body and fields. There's a ton of bombardment with any electromagnetic fields in our day-to-day. Doesn't really matter what you think about 5G. It's additional frequencies. So 4G still exists, and 4G is the 4th generation. A lot of people confuse 5G and with 2.4 or 5G on your wireless router. 5G, the G stands for generation instead of gigahertz. So 2.4 and 5G on your router is 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. 4G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, as for wireless technology beaming off a cell tower, the G is just generation. And there's multiple frequencies in 5G. The one that's of concern, because it adds to that electromagnetic bombardment, is the higher frequency, upwards of 30 gigahertz, and that's the millimeter wave technology. Doesn't really matter if you think there's an agenda behind it, and I definitely do, because it's fairly obvious at this point. It's an extra electromagnetic bombardment, and it doesn't matter if it's ionizing radiation or not. It's been shown that any radiation disrupts intracellular communication. That's the ion channels within your cell that allow us to communicate, our microbiome communicate with our cells, brainwave states. All of that is an extra information field we have to deal with. So the way to get around that, if you live in a dense area is to, if you can, get out into the woods. Any living thing generates its own information field, and living organisms are generally a slower pace and more in line with our natural information field. So just to bring yourself back in the center, make an effort to come wherever you feel most relaxed, either if that's in the woods, by the water, on top of a mountain, wherever. Get out, get some sunshine, bathe in those healing properties of the natural world, and I'm going to do some brief meditation. And the sun's starting to go down here in western North Carolina. It's getting a little chilly. I'll talk to you guys on the next video.